with the flat metal fitting into the buckle and pull the strap to tighten. To release, simply lift the upper portion of the buckle. Turbulence may occur with no warning, so we recommend that you keep your seatbelt fastened at all times, even when the seatbelt sign is off. In the event of emergency, you will hear the command to brace. Refer to your safety features card for your brace position. Do not take any carry-on items with you during evacuation and follow the directions of the flight crew. There's a total number of 18 emergency exits on board this aircraft. There are 4 window exits located in the cabin over the wing, 2 emergency door exits located in the forward, and 2 emergency door exits located in the rear. Please take note to find the exit nearest you along with all the exits, keeping in mind these will be right behind you. Should a power loss or emergency occur, floor level lighting will come on automatically and all exits will be indicated by, you guessed it, illuminated exit sign. Now should the cabin pressure change, full oxygen mask will automatically drop from the panel located above you. Remain seated and immediately pull the mask towards you to start the flow of oxygen. Place that regular mask over your nose and mouth, securing it behind your heavy elastic strap. Pull on the 2 loose ends at the front to tighten. Please put on your own mask prior to assisting others.
Oh dear.
In preparation for takeoff, please ensure your seat back is upright and your tray table has been stowed. If your electronic device becomes wedged within the seat, do not adjust the seat or try to retrieve it. Call your cabin crew immediately for assistance and always use care when retrieving your carry-on items from the overhead bin to avoid injury to yourself or other guests. Thanks for making this part of your flight today. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight.
Oh, he's gonna do it in French. Oh yay.
Y compris les ordinateurs portables sous le ciel devant vous ou dans un compartiment supérieur.
That is good. Does anybody speak French? Old style humor.
Votre sécurité est notre sécurité. Veuillez nous accorder votre attention alors que nous présentons les mesures de sécurité suivantes. Vous trouverez devant vous une carte des mesures de sécurité concernant cet avion. Veuillez en suivre avec nous les points importants. La cabine est munie de voyants concernant les ceintures et l'interdiction de fumer. Veuillez vous y conformer en tout temps. Il est interdit de fumer, d'utiliser des cigarettes électroniques ou des vapoteuses et de consommer vos propres boissons alcoolisées, y compris celles achetées au boutique. Votre ceinture de sécurité doit être bouclée et ajustée à vos hanches lorsque les voyants des ceintures sont allumés. Pour ce faire, insérez la languette de métal dans la boucle et appuyez sur la courroie pour l'ajuster. Pour la détacher, soulevez la boucle. L'urgence peut survenir sans avertissement. Nous vous recommandons de garder votre ceinture bouclée en tout temps, même lorsque les voyants des ceintures sont éteints. En cas d'urgence, vous entendrez une commande vous demandant de prendre votre position de protection. Consultez votre carte des mesures de sécurité pour connaître votre position de protection. Ne prenez aucun bagage avec vous en cas d'évacuation et suivez les directives de l'équipage. Il y a au total 8 sorties de secours, soit 4 lots de sortie au milieu de la cabine, au-dessus des ailes, 2 portes à l'avant et 2 portes à l'arrière. Prenez le temps de repérer la sortie la plus proche de votre siège ainsi que l'emplacement des autres sorties. Pas d'alimentation d'urgence, l'éclairage de plancher suivra et toutes les sorties seront indiquées par leur enseigne de sortie. En cas de changement de pression dans la cabine, le panneau situé au-dessus de vous s'ouvrira et déclenchera les masques à oxygène. Tirez immédiatement sur un masque et se libère. Laissez-le sur votre nez et votre bouche tout en passant la bande élastique derrière votre tête. Tirez sur les 2 extrémités à l'avant pour l'ajuster. Mettez votre masque en premier avant d'aider les autres. En préparation du décollage, veuillez redresser votre siège et votre tablette. Si votre appareil électronique reste coincé dans votre siège, n'essayez pas de le récupérer ou d'ajuster le siège. Demandez immédiatement l'aide de membres de l'équipage de cabine. Afin d'éviter de vous blesser ou de blesser d'autres invités, faites attention tout le temps lorsque vous récupérez vos bagages dans les compartiments supérieurs. Merci d'avoir choisi WestJet pour votre vol aujourd'hui. N'hésitez pas à communiquer avec les membres de l'équipage de cabine si vous avez des questions ou des préoccupations liées à la sécurité. Nous vous souhaitons un bon vol.
seguridad. Cierre sus manos, brazos, pies y piernas.
Here's a huge A380 almost popping off the runway in Dusseldorf because of Storm Xavier. In the video, you can see how the lateral airflow caught the airliner already at the very ground and almost flipped it. Here's another side wind preventing a Boeing 767 from landing at the Prague airport, almost overturning it. The gusts were so strong that the pilots had to try to land twice in order to cope with the wind and protect the passengers. It's amazing that everything ended well. This time, the crew is fighting the windstorm Friederike that took over the Netherlands and Germany on January the 18th, 2018. The wind speed in the epicenter reached 140 kilometers per hour, so most of the airports were closed, but some of them were still functioning, and they received pilots who already got up in the air. One of these airports was Dusseldorf. Here, the wind speed reached 110 kilometers per hour, or about 30 meters per second, and believe us, that is very much. The twin-engine turboprop airliner Bombardier Q400 waggling in the air looks like it can't land at all, especially sideways. Now you're thinking there's nothing worse than wind, surely. But what about a sandstorm? Landing an airplane in the midst of a sandstorm sounds like an impossible mission because you simply can't see where to land at all when there's only sand and roaring wind around. Well, probably the human pilot was helped by the autopilot, or maybe he had some kind of aviation luck and special flair for the runway, because let's be honest, you can't rely only on electronic devices of the plane in the middle of such a storm like this. Of course, not only large liners have malfunctions, but small private planes too. As for example, in this case, the pilots of the tiny aircraft circled over the city for 1.5 hours after realizing his chassis was malfunctioning. It was necessary to waste all the fuel, otherwise the emergency landing could have ignited the craft. Fortunately, it did end well. Moreover, the landing was so soft that the plane literally slipped on the fuselage like a small boat for quite a few feet and then calmly stopped. You ask, why are we so sure the pilot wasn't hurt? Because look at him getting out of the cabin looking like he does this every day. I'll go get myself a burger. Oh, maybe even two. On December the 11th, 2013, a Makani Kai airplane flying from Kalaupapa to Honolulu crashed due to a failed single engine. The pilot was forced to land on the water, and perhaps this story would remain somewhere in Hawaii if it weren't for one of the passengers, fisherman Ferdinand Puentes, who accidentally filmed it all on a GoPro. Well, what else can you do when your plane's falling into the ocean, right? According to Ferdinand, 2 minutes after takeoff, the passengers heard a loud sound from the engine and immediately realized what was going to happen. When the aircraft descended on the water, the passengers managed to get out of the cabin, and the pilot, despite the injury received during the landing, kept giving instructions and preventing panic.
The worst fear of every air traveler. Side of the plane. Everybody okay?
The author of this video, which decided to fly over the state of Maine, claims this landing was quite soft. According to him, it wasn't exactly how it looks on the video. He just saw a road usually used by wood-producing equipment and decided to land on it. Wait, what? But we think it's kind of professional modesty. After all, ask any of our heroes and they'll probably tell you they were just doing their job. Nothing special. Still, this landing on the road looks incredibly impressive. You probably noticed that pilots try not to let the plane get out of the runway while landing. And you know, it's not because they don't want to ruin the lawn on the airport. Look what happens when malfunctioning chassis meets soil at a huge speed.
Airport now, and again, emergency crews are on the ground. He is in contact, and he's getting close. Sorry, Josh, he's coming in close. Oh, look at the sparks.
but thanks to the pilot, none of the passengers were hurt. On November 1st, 2011, a Boeing 767 of the Polish air company LOT flying from Newark, USA, was crash landing in Warsaw with a defective chassis. When we say defective, we mean it wasn't opening at all. Due to the failure of the central hydraulic system, not a single gear was out, so the pilots had to land the liner directly on the fuselage. After receiving information about the failure, the crew decided to waste as much fuel as possible to avoid a fire, and circled over the Polish capital for an hour. Airport services were notified of the problem, and during this time managed to prepare for an emergency landing. The emergency plane was met by fire trucks, ambulances, and buses. In addition, the runway was covered with a special foam to reduce the friction during landing, but everyone understood perfectly well that even such precautions might not help because the risk is too great. When landing, there were sparks and smoke flying around, but the liner didn't catch fire. After the stop, all 220 passengers and 11 crew members were evacuated on inflatable ramps. As you've already noticed, the problem with the chassis is one of the most common in civil aviation. So on September 21st, 2005, the A320 plane flying to New York was forced to land at the Los Angeles airport because of the nose landing gear, whose wheel turned at a right angle. Since the A320 doesn't have an emergency fuel draining system, the pilots were forced to fly in circles over the ocean for 2 hours to get rid of it. The captain warned the stewards that the nose gear could break down when landing, and they prepared for the evacuation of the passengers. Finally, at 18:18, at a speed of 222 km per hour, the aircraft touched the 3,382 meter long runway. The captain tried to keep the nose of the liner as high as possible in order to avoid the destruction of the nose landing gear. However, in the end, it did touch the concrete. The tires burst and caught fire, but soon went out. At 18:20, the plane completely stopped, having driven practically along the entire runway.
End of the runway.
Mighty strong landing gear here. That's the tires burning out there. The chin gear, the chin of that aircraft did not skid down the runway.
Despite the emergency, landing was very safe, and the pilot's work was done perfectly. None of the 146 people on board were injured. On August 21st, 1963, an almost new Tu-124 plane was flying from Tallinn to Moscow. There were 44 passengers and 6 crew members on board. It was the most usual morning flight, and everything seemed fine. But immediately after takeoff, the crew found that the front support of the chassis wasn't completely removed. It was necessary to land at the nearest airport, but to avoid a fire, the fuel had to be wasted as well, and so the captain began to fly around Leningrad at half a kilometer high, but suddenly one of the 2 engines stopped working. According to the readouts, there was enough fuel to get to the airport, but now it was necessary to fly straight through Leningrad instead of flying in circles. Suddenly, in the sky above the city, the second engine stopped working, and the fuel gauge for some reason showed 0, although just a few minutes ago there was 200 liters. The crew didn't have time for thinking or hesitation. They had to land the aircraft on the river, and thanks to the pilot's actions, the water landing went surprisingly successfully. Not a single bottle was even broken on board. After the Tu-124 was towed to the shore and people descended onto the land, a few minutes later the plane